panel 3 is going to continue our discussion about how do we reclaim existing land and property and how do we breathe new life into it. And so I am going to now turn it over to Colin Campbell, who has agreed to moderate this panel. So welcome, guys. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's, I think we've all had the experience of going through the countryside and looking across a hedge and seeing a derelict building, broken down fences, just a sign of disrepair. And you wonder, in a community that prides itself on its property and it's so special because it's so small, that any property would be allowed to fall into disrepair, such as we see. How did it get there? And what would it take to redo it? I think we've all, at one time or another, imagined what we would do with that piece of property. Well, this panel is going to help share with you some of the thoughts around that and even some solutions. Perhaps we can just do a quick introduction, starting with Akilah.
Sure. Hello, my name is Akilah Swan. I am the director of Aina, Curated, an architecture firm here in Bermuda. I'm also the chair of the Historic Building Advisory Committee, and I also lead the major works projects for Habitat for Humanity Bermuda.
I'm Karen Border. I'm the executive director of the Bermuda National Trust.
My name is Jonathan Castro. I am the principal architect at ESA Studios, formerly Cooper Gardner.
Hi, I'm Paul McDonald. I'm the Assistant Director of the Department of Planning.
My name's Cynthia Millett. I'm a property attorney at Conyers, Dillon Pierman.
Thank you. And I'm Colin Campbell. I'm the Senior Architect and Director for OBMI Bermuda. Reclaiming ruins, what does that mean for us? Akilah, how would you interpret that?
Sure. I would interpret reclaiming our ruins as really looking at how we redevelop our existing infrastructure and how we make it beautiful again and how we bring our communities back up to the Bermuda image to a level and a standard that serves our entire population.
For me, it really means two things. The first one is sustainability. As we all know, we've got a tiny landmass. It's always been easier to build on open space than to renovate, easier and cheaper to build on open space than to renovate old buildings. But we can't do that anymore. I hope we're all agreed that our open space is precious and it's running out, if not run out. We need to protect what is left, so we really need to focus on those brownfield sites for sustainability for the future. And the second important piece of this for me is that some of these old buildings are precious elements of our cultural heritage. They are listed buildings. Not all old and derelict buildings are worth protecting. Some of them, frankly, could be knocked down. But we do have a listed building register, and some of these properties that are falling to rack and ruin are worth protecting for their cultural heritage value.
Certainly looking at pockets of density where we can improve, reutilizing old buildings, creating micro units where we can, really using the limited landmass that we have, even to the point of building higher as one aspect. Using ruins doesn't mean that you are taking away the importance of the space. You are uplifting it with architectural or in planning stages, but really revitalizing and thinking of it as a different use and how that might attract a larger community.
Yeah, I think just touching on the brownfield point, that is a key pillar of sustainable development across the globe, really. It does have an added importance with Bermuda, with it being only 21 square miles in land mass, so there is a definite limit on how much land is available in Bermuda, so focusing on previous developed sites is very, very important. In terms of just the reusing and repairing, revitalizing buildings, that in itself has its own benefit for the community. Nobody wants to have a vacant building in their area. Sometimes they're kept up quite well, but often they're not. And yeah, having a building vacant does inherently adversely impact the character of an area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to point out from a legal point of perspective, that essentially, put it up here. Sorry. Okay, not used to it. But from a legal point of view, looking at giving clients advice and educating them what their options are when they're in a position where they believe they own a property but don't have title deeds, or this property's been in my family forever and I've been living there and I have nothing to document that I own it. And there generally is an ethos in Bermuda that basically I will let property stay in my family forever even if I can't afford to develop it or if it falls into ruin. So basically from a legal point, looking at educating individuals and giving them options as to what they can do to basically bring back and restore their properties. Even if it is working out lease agreements, long-term lease agreements, getting developers involved, or even BHC as an option. But actually education and knowing what your options are, and if you don't know what you can do with it, we have a problem with basic derelict properties and derelict ruins.
Most interesting. It seems an anomaly that we're running around looking for ruined buildings to bring them back to life. The planning department some years ago put out supposed to be a yearly report. It's called a Housing Audit and Land Analysis, and it makes for some compelling reading. And if you extract from the information from 2022 forward, you'll see that we have just under 30,000 habitable units in Bermuda. What it turns out to also is that we've got about 34,000 registered ARV units. So there's 4,000 unoccupied spaces around Bermuda. And that comes as a big surprise to myself and a whole bunch of others. We'll get into a couple of reasons why in just a second. So it's interesting, we're in an interesting point where we have a increasing need for accommodation and a declining population in certain sectors and an increasing age situation in other sectors. We have an increasing need for housing, good quality housing in areas where the quality of the housing isn't very good at all. So leading off this discussion, we want to ask the basic question is like, what are the challenges here of reclaiming these ruins and bringing them into a fit state? We'll start off with the planning issues. What do we have? That's one of the first stops for most people. What are the planning issues?
As our director mentioned, planning should be the first stop if anybody wants to look at redeveloping their property. So, yeah, there are a few different reasons, I think. One, it's not applicable to most properties, but the fact that buildings are listed, that can actually be quite a negative selling point for certain people. Some people do have the perception that you just can't touch a listed building. It is seen sometimes as a negative or really just getting in the way of what somebody wants to do with the property. We would like to say that's not the case. There are lots of things you can do with listed buildings. It does depend a lot on the actual building itself, the character, the grading. You don't necessarily have to replace every window with $1,000 or several $1,000 timber framed windows in all cases. So there are different solutions to the issue of what to do if you do have a listed building, but it really should be seen as something which is an asset rather than something which is a hindrance. In terms of what the department has been doing, there is a total of 791 listed buildings in Bermuda. They were all listed, well, almost all around the 90s. So it's been quite a while since this list has been reviewed. We have been in the process of reviewing that list, so we do now have new criteria on what we think should be well, buildings should be judged against in terms of assessing whether they should be listed, whether they should be listed grade 1, grade 2, or grade 3. So that's some work which we've been undertaking. It's a very large project with there being so many of the buildings. We will have a lot of buildings which will be reclassified or even removed from the list, and there will be others which are added to the list as well. But that's one of the, I'll let the other panelists speak to some of the other wider issues, but in terms of listed buildings themselves, that is one of the aspects as we're seeing as being a potential hurdle.
But you've had a very clever study recently going into the hedgerows and actually trying to count and identify the houses that are ruins. Can you share how many have you uncovered so far?
It's difficult to define ruins because there's so many different definitions. So there are several different categories of habitability for buildings as well. So it could go as far as a building which is almost available to be occupied with a few small changes, but there could be others with no roof. So there's very great degrees of what would constitute a ruin, and consequently what buildings would be retained on the list. So as Cara mentioned earlier, there are lots of buildings which are kind of beyond repair, and they don't have the character which made them listed in the first place. But there are others which, they are, whilst you can consider them ruins, they do still have their intrinsic value, which could be retained.
Yeah, but didn't you mention something around 250 odd homes so far that you've identified as being in that borderline area?
No, that's something else I'll be talking about.
Something else completed. There you go. Okay, we'll come back to that. So the other compelling issue here is going to be the legal entanglements of trying to, how do we resuscitate a ruined building and property? Cynthia, would you be so kind?
Well, quite a few of the properties fall into...
Could you use your mic, please?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Quite a few of the properties fall into ruin for several reasons, mostly economic, financial. Individuals have had properties, and especially if you have a property that's listed, they're expensive to maintain. Sometimes you have to replace like with like. So usually that's basically the financial burden of keeping our properties. And in Bermuda, you have multi-generational wealth, which is property. And a lot of individuals, even if they can't afford to maintain it, they don't want to let property out of their family. And if there's no family members that are there to take it on or maintain it or whichever, a lot of the resulting points become ruins. And let's say if a family member's up in age, where would they get the money to improve the property? So if you're not of an age where you can borrow money, or if you're in a position that you don't have children and you don't, so a lot of these properties just stay in families and nobody does anything with them. The other issue is lost title deeds. If you can prove good title to your property, and if you're have any ability to borrow from a bank, or if you can borrow to make improvements. So you have individuals that have properties, they've lived, as I touched on before, for many years, and they just know that's my house. And they're not aware of the deeds, or they're not as sophisticated. Previously to the Administration of Estate Act 1974, you could transfer property by will. So you just put your legal description and a lot plan in your will, and it went to the next person. So a lot of that was how properties transferred hands. And if individuals didn't have safety deposit boxes and didn't keep a watch on their documents, then they don't have documented ownership. We now have the Land Title Registry Office, where you can produce affidavits if you don't have legal documents to provide proof that you've owned it. It's easier if you have a house that has an ARV and you've paid land tax, you've paid utility bills, and you have some proof. But at that point, the Land Title Registry will give you provisional title if it's satisfied that the evidence that you've proved can prove ownership. However, with vacant lots, it's a lot difficult because there's no proof of taxes, and in Bermuda, taxes aren't payable on vacant lots. And when people look economically at the value of them, and if there's boundary disputes, because people tend to encroach. So if there's a lot next to me and no one's using it, people tend to move over, move their steps over, move their yard over, and move. So a lot of these properties have title issues as far as encroachments, where neighbors have said, that's my backyard. I've had that for 20 years. So then when you go to sell it and you give it to an agent, then the agent looks at the history, they get the boundary surveyed, and they're like, oh God. And then you look at what you can do with it. So there's like lots of issues that come up. And even if the Land Title Registry can give it provisional title, which is not the highest class, you have to wait 20 years because that's the statutory period for adverse possession or squatter's rights before they will give it full legal title. And with that provisional title, you can't borrow, you can't do anything with it. So it is a solution, but it's not ideal if you're looking to redevelop or do anything with the land right away. So that's basically, so there are ways to fix these. And then there's other issues where you have title deeds, but you have family members that just don't get along. And I'm sure I'm sure everyone's experienced it in the family. I'm a 1/10 owner of this house. 90% of the other owners want to sell, but I don't. And there is something called the Partition Act, where you can go to court if you own property with family members which you don't agree with, but it's expensive, it's litigious, and then by the end of the day, the person that makes the most money is the lawyers, and at the end of the day, does anything happen? And even with a lot of these properties, you have individuals that own them that are estates, where the person has died and the beneficiaries of the state own them. And when they are not, and they're reticent to pay or want to settle the estate to claim this 1/10 or 1/15 of a property, which they have to agree with how many other individuals to sell. So that's one of the issues that we encounter often. But generally, it's usually economics, lost title deeds, boundary issues, or family members reluctant to sell.
Most compelling. What about the financial aspect? How do the banks then get into, because they're the next person down the food chain saying, okay, we've got this property, we want to do something with it, we want to borrow some money. What have you run into?
Well, if you have to, one of the things is you have to have good legal title to, in order to borrow. So if you have lost title deeds, there's the issue with borrowing. So you'd have to use other collateral or other property that you owned to that. So basically, as lawyers, when we're engaged to prepare a mortgage for someone's borrowing, we have to certify good title to the bank. And the bank looks at us, and if there's an issue with the title, they sue the law firm if they can't sell the asset. So it's not as simple as just, that basically there may be issues, and if there's are encroachments or boundary disputes, we have to highlight them to the bank, and that might be an impediment commercially to lending. Or also, if there's planning issues, individuals have added on steps, built things on the property without planning permission, as you do. And then when you go and get a planning cert, you find out I get an enforcement notice from you.
I didn't hear that.
And we're like, okay, this loan isn't going through. Or basically, or there's substantial arrears in land tax. One of the things with the Bermuda government, that is something they do not chase, not unless it gets in. So most of the individuals that have mortgages, when they go to borrow, I'm like, oh my God, you've never paid your land tax. And then it's like 20, 30,000, and there's a lot of, that's the case with quite a few people. So that's it. So those are the larger issues. And then as far as what the qualifying, basically, if you're going to borrow, what each bank's qualifying criteria are. I find the smaller banks are more adverse to risk, BCB, Clarion, where you have the larger banks, which have a bigger appetite for risk, and they will close if there's a wall in the wrong place or there's a boundary issue if the borrower undertakes to rectify it. So there are issues, but if it's something substantial that affects the value of the property, they won't allow it. So generally, it is difficult. And then in Bermuda, if you are a senior, generally the banks don't lend past 65. So you have to have some criteria or either add children onto your property as guarantors so you can borrow the additional funds. And a lot of children don't like the responsibility. They have to get independent legal advice. So those are some of the challenges as far as borrowing to restore some of these properties.
Okay. Well, if that wasn't enough, there's, why start now? So what about the design aspect, Jonathan? Share with us what you've seen, what you think, and where we should go, perhaps.
So certainly looking at planning statements and policies these days, there are limitations when you're dealing with historic buildings, per se. What does the historic really mean? Usually it's an exterior element to it. How do you adapt it? How do you do all that? The challenges you face is many homeowners, new homeowners, don't have the capital to invest in this, so they look to the banks for help and assistance. Certainly there is a design element that we provide, sketches and that level, but really it is a challenge for these first-time homeowners to think down the line and stare down the barrel of a very expensive gun when they're looking at like home ownership and being scared by historic buildings and those developments. How we design is really a reaction to what the owner wants, but they don't know what the bill looks like at the end until you've gone all the way down the road with planning permissions. And these certainly, to Cynthia's point earlier about the banks having a model where there's some sort of startup capital help pay for these costs rather than design everything, getting 3 contractors price and find out at the end of the day you actually can't afford to build these. Prices are what the prices are, whether you're in Douglastown or you're down the road from here, the cost per square foot is what it is. There's no differential between where you live. It's a hard task. As those who own their own homes, you know what a cost of paint can is from Rose Sperlings versus Pembroke paint, and what you need to do to pay for these wooden windows versus PVC. These are all real challenges that don't really separate you financially. How you design is always a important aspect financially, and in a way, it is the only thing that we can really do as architects is help our clients. Certainly, having a better avenue with the policies at hand is important. So we look at density as one aspect. Can people reutilize their house and look at more income through smaller units, and as a way to get some sort of financial freedom in those? Those are important issues to obviously unpack in future discussions.
Okay. Well, it's rare you have an absolute expert in this matter, but I can't think of any other organization other than the National Trust, which has the challenges of resuscitating and doing them beautifully ruins. What is your experience? What are the challenges the National Trust faces?
Well, yes, indeed, we do own we own and care for 26 listed buildings across Bermuda. So when we're talking about the expense of looking after historic buildings, yes, it is a challenge. There's no escaping that. It is more expensive to renovate, restore, conserve historic buildings than to build new. And the challenges of looking after old buildings are considerable. But people may be surprised that actually I agree with a lot of what Paul said here, is I think there's a lot of misconceptions as well out there about what you can and can't do with historic buildings. There are different grade levels. Grade 1, yes, it's like-for-like restoration. These are our most precious pieces of cultural heritage, either for their architectural value or the history and the stories related to the house. But grade 2 and grade 3 listed buildings, they may have features that are very important to conserve, but that doesn't mean that you can't add additions. That doesn't mean that you cannot change some of the materials, for example, particularly if it's not in the primary aspect. I think we can often be seen at the National Trust as saying no to everything and wanting to fix things in aspect. That is not the case. We do not object to everything out there, and we're very much in support of helping homeowners to restore and conserve the houses and make them into comfortable, modern amenities. This is in everybody's interest that we give buildings new life, literally. And there are many fine architects on the island who are very skilled at this. I look around, I see faces out there of people who have restored old buildings really beautifully, very sensitively, and turned them into very comfortable, modern places to live and work.
Okay, very good, very good. So, Akilah, the social impact of the challenges of reclaiming ruins. What has been your experience and the impact that you've seen and felt?
Yeah, I'm going to speak to this from the Habitat hat, just because we actually did recently renovate a historic property, and one of them is Bridge House, which is right next to Somerset Bridge. And I remember when we went to it, of course, it was a monumental task to approach it, but what it has done to the community, I mean, it's an absolute jewel to go by it now and see that this building has been renovated. It really does make such a change within a neighborhood. So those are some of the big, that was one specific project, but overall, whenever we're seeing a development within a community take place, it always is a facelift. Paul had mentioned about antisocial behavior as a result of buildings being broken down, where as a result of touching them and fixing them, we're addressing that problem. So those are some of the things.
Okay, yeah. Very good, very good. It does seem quite extreme, as I said, that we have valuable property which is falling into disrepair and ruin. Bermuda has a very unique archetype design look and feel, and it's known globally. Sometimes we don't understand it well enough ourselves, but when we travel and you see photographs of Bermuda, everyone recognizes Bermuda right away. It's very, very unique. It's just like if you see a tall tower with a clock in it, it's Big Ben, you know it's England. A tall tower, it's Eiffel Tower, you know, all that sort of stuff. So Bermuda has a very, very strong brand, and it's really important, especially with these properties, that we look at them and understand them. But just having to deal with the heavy weight of like, oh, what are we going to do now with all these things? Let's explore some solutions, because there really are some solutions out there to bring these properties back into the fold and add them, and perhaps give them a whole new purpose, a whole new life. So starting with planning, how would we tackle these projects with planning? Is there some sort of accelerated move or means that people say, look, this has been a problem for a long area, it's got some issues, help me, what do we do?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. So I think the first step in tackling the problem is to find out exactly what we have, what is actually out there, what's available. I think the second panel made reference to a property portal, and that is actually quite in line with some work we've been doing over the past couple of years in putting together a map of all of the vacant and derelict properties across Bermuda. So we've actually taken the data from land valuation records, we've taken what they class as uninhabitable buildings, and we've created a map which includes all of those. So there's a total of 290 properties on that map. 25 of those are listed buildings. And each property includes like a photograph and the zoning of the property. So you can at least get an idea of what's out there and what the zoning is. So if somebody does want to look at potentially developing one of those properties, they do have at least some basic information. The purpose of the map at this stage is not to do what one of the previous panels had as a development opportunities at this stage. So really we're just doing the first step of finding out what's there. Mm-hmm. And just collating that information. So it's important that we do collaborate. We've already spoken to 3 other ministries about this, and we are doing this as a collective effort ultimately. We've done the first step, and the second and subsequent steps will involve further collaboration with other departments to really come up with, hopefully, a very comprehensive mapping system of what is actually out there in Bermuda, and from there we can develop that into identifying certain properties for redevelopment. There will be certain properties in there which I say are the listed buildings which we would like to retain. So there will have to be certain initiatives and like Karen mentioned earlier, really just trying to explain and educate people to what you can actually do with these buildings as well. So having that information out there publicly, we think, is a very important first step. It's something which, yeah, we've worked on hard, and it's something that it would be updated on a regular basis. So I think just getting that information out there and available to get things started is a really good initial point.
Would there be a coordinated effort if someone was interested in looking at revitalizing a house or a building or a property, that they could go to your list and make a contact with the presumptive owners?
It is possible to get that information right now, but people have to pay a different department to get that information.
Okay. So
we would encourage that department to waive that fee, which may not be a popular call from their end. But I mean, there is a greater good and a real purpose for doing that. If we are going to try to encourage people to develop, I think we need to take down as many perceived and actual barriers as possible. And yeah, actually identifying the owners of the properties can be quite challenging. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think just being able to get as much information in one place is also very important as well, because I can see it's very frustrating for people to go from one department to another, then to another. We're hoping that planning can be the point where we can get all of that information put together, and it will hopefully encourage people to put proposals forward.
Okay, very good. It's been said by some that the one thing Bermuda does best is we make easy hard, but you know. So, Cynthia, solutions. You've laid out a whole series of legal issues and other constraints. How do you see us getting around these and opening up some opportunities so that these properties can come back and be invested in?
It would be interesting if Paul can put together, like with the lists that are being compiled, and individuals are now making an effort to make people aware of these properties. People drive by them, we see them, but we don't know the number. We don't know the issues behind it. And since we do have, at the moment, a shortage of housing, and if this information can be compiled, then again, it's down to the legal issues, if we can find the owners, if they're interested in selling, or they can be convinced to do that. They do have a Land Acquisition Act where the government can compulsorily purchase property. But again, I don't think that will be very popular if individuals want to keep property in their families. So with that being said, it's basically contacting the individuals and seeing if they want to sell. But at the moment, I don't see there's anything that you can do to compel someone who's not in a legal position to sell, or is interested in selling, and family members. So basically, the issues that I touched on earlier, I don't think we can force individuals, but again, the information is out there. And if individuals are interested in properties and they're able to use these resources, they can look into it, try and find out who the owners are, and encourage them to sell if they want to.
Okay. So, Jonathan, how would we look at these properties in a design point of view, say, we ought to rethink this, it's either going to be putting it back to where it was, or we need to completely turn the wheel on this thing and give it a whole new spin? How would you tackle that? How would you give someone the confidence to do that?
So I think the first question is there any life left in the building? Which is sort of the topic at hand, the ruin as it stands. And as my dad would say as a contractor, sometimes it's easier to knock down than to rebuild, than to use what you got because of the limitations. Certainly, there are a lot of empty buildings around the island, some under government possession, some under personal possession. They're standing there, there's a perception that they have the value there. Reality is it's brick and mortar that's being held together, likely by time, Band-Aids, and hope. So that's the first step, is what is valuable, what is left to save. It may just be the property at the end of the day. So start fresh with a new build. It will help us last longer. But for those buildings that do have the value, some government-owned buildings, I'll take Bishop Spencer, for example. It's a very large property. The building, as I remember, is quite sound. Yes, it has its problems. Certainly, an assessment is needed. As we were talking earlier in the week, sometimes you don't know until you open up those walls what the problems really are. I think that's where the lending can kind of come in from a banking support. The smaller banks may be willing to give out a smaller loan to help offset some of the initial cost, really get down into what you're really dealing with, but certainly you might be in the middle of construction, you realize the roof that's above your head is really just being held together by twine. You don't really know, right? So these are a lot of challenges. To offset the front costs is what we really need to do before someone wants to physically and emotionally get involved with Bermuda. And this applies to locals and internationals. Certainly in the panel before, spoke highly about foreign versus local. That's an always debate that will always happen in Bermuda. From an architect's perspective, it doesn't really make a difference. Certainly allowing less gateways or gatekeeping to make the easier less hard, as Colin just said, needs to be something that we have to look at from a financial point, from a policy point of view. Planning is obviously the first step in this. How do you reuse the building? How does that really allow you to do what you really want to do and get your bang for your buck? From a developer standpoint, as a homeowner, how can I really dig into this and get what I want out of it? I think that in itself sort of talks about perhaps there's a policy change that needs to happen. Maybe from a planning statement who are looking at the buildings. Maybe there is a look at what the standards are for studios or small one-bedrooms. Maybe they can be smaller. How do you create a model of home that is affordable and accessible to everybody? Really, it doesn't really matter. The driving factor is the person coming in, give them a sense of place, whether they be local or foreign, have them invest in Bermuda, have them go down to local Gorhams and whoever you're supporting, and learn how to fix their roof and patch it up. We got into this in earlier discussions this week about education, which I think Akilah might talk to later on. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay. And from the point of view of the National Trust, you've mentioned something very, very innovative at lunch today, and perhaps you want to share that as part of a possible solution and giving people the impetus to move forward.
Absolutely. I think that it's clear there's no easy solutions, and I think it's going to take a multi-pronged approach, a combination of carrot and stick, incentive and penalty. We need to find ways to support those who simply do not have the finances to renovate their homes and look after their homes. There has to be some kind of funding mechanism. There was an interest-free loan approach, but there's issues with that. And at the same time, penalties by way of taxes, for example, land tax, increasing in rate, for example, if you own multiple derelict properties. At the moment, I think there's a very limited amount payable on an uninhabited property. So carrot and stick, I do think there needs to be a multi-pronged approach. One of the solutions that we have used at the National Trust in the past, when faced with a building that needs to be restored, and we didn't have the capital to do it, was the long lease. So we have some buildings that are on 999-year leases and some that are on 99-year leases or less, whereby you sell the leaseholder puts in the capital to restore the building, but we remain the landlord. And there's two benefits to that. Is one that if you don't have the capital yourself to do it, someone else can put in the capital. Working out the financial mechanism for that isn't easy, but there are plenty of models out there to follow to figure out what's the right price point that is going to benefit the leaseholder and the landlord. One of the advantages from the landlord's perspective is that long term you don't lose control of the property. You, for example, if you live in a property and the next door lot you also own, but it's got a falling down house on it, you haven't got the capital to put it in, but you do not want to sell that because you don't want to see a bunch of condos go up next door. You're concerned to keep that property in the family. There are ways to control it by means of the terms of the lease. So the footprint of the house can't be changed, for example. You can require ongoing maintenance by the leaseholder. There's many mechanisms. So I think we do have to be creative, is the point, and look at different kinds of solutions that may not be very familiar in Bermuda, but there are options, and it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. Certainly, I think there's scope for additional penalties for people who are sitting on derelict houses, but do have the money to do something about it. But there also needs to be support for those who own historic buildings and would love to look after them, but simply don't have the money to do so. So carrot and stick, I think, is going to be the answer.
Okay. And Akilah, in terms of just the social fabric, what the best solutions for this, from your perspective, would be what?
Yeah, so I'm a big advocate for education in this arena. What we value as precious, we're going to preserve. And it's interesting because our architecture is iconic. We talked about earlier, when you think about Bermudian architecture, what's the first thing that comes to mind? There you go, the white roof. And so this is something that we know as an archetype, but we're not taught this in our schools. I remember going overseas to both work and study, and people from different countries had a real strong sense of their architecture, whereas oftentimes, I know for myself, we're being taught somebody else's. And so you have things like Pinterest and HGTV coming in and influencing how we produce our work, when we actually have something that's so beautiful. Heather Pinnock actually in her presentation talked about the fact that sustainable architecture does not have to be new technology. We have a vernacular architecture that has been responding to climate change for centuries. And so now we're moving away from that when we really need to be learning from it and gleaning from it. So I would say architecture, just having the understanding of our architecture, of our vernacular construction from the time children are little all the way up to they're going away to school, even to those who are coming into our shores, really understanding what does it mean to have a Bermuda roof. How do we even get that? What is that architectural, not only language, but what is the craftsmanship that went into that? How was that built? What are the resources that we had on island to make that work, and why it looks that way, the proportions? So really having that delved into, and then even talking about how do you maintain a property? You know, we're not educated from the standpoint of house maintenance, and I feel like other jurisdictions do that really well, where a mortgage comes with a class on how to maintain that property. Given that the cost for construction in Bermuda and maintenance is so high, it behooves us to actually have that embedded into a lot of our systems. So that's something that I think socially we can do better at. If I can take one more point to say this, I had a really great conversation with Heather, so that's why I keep mentioning her. The University of Jamaica has an architecture school that actually is accredited with the RIBA in London, and they, as a part of their program, do tours within the Caribbean to learn the actual archetype in the Caribbean. And I thought, what a great opportunity for them to then come to Bermuda and learn our architectural type. And that's a great place for tourism. That's a great place for architecture, the community here, so that they're not learning somebody else's architecture, not knowing their own. And then, of course, we start to have transculturation, where we're inspiring them as well with what we do. So, yeah, my big drum that I like to bang is architecture on all levels for our community. I'm sorry, education on all levels for our community.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that. Absolutely. And I think, to be honest, we could do more at the National Trust when it comes to educating about how to maintain and care for buildings. And it's something we've actually been talking about recently, increasing the education that we do. But I think an important point that Akilah raised there was keeping the skills within our community. The Department of Culture does have a wonderful apprenticeship scheme, but it's pretty limited. We've lost a lot of the skills. The young people coming up are not necessarily learning how to fit slate roofs and repair slate roofs. They're not necessarily learning how to deal with some of our very specific issues here in Bermuda. So I think there is a lot of scope out there for apprenticeship schemes for passing on those skills, and it's I would love it if someone would fund for the National Trust to take on an apprentice, and we would teach them all the skills they need in order to maintain and restore historic buildings. But I think that's a really key piece that is missing here on the island at the moment.
And if I could just say, I think that's an opportunity even for collaboration with workforce development, because they are doing training. So there is that opportunity to be teaching, because some of the expense comes from a labor force that doesn't know how to tackle our own buildings, and then bringing other people coming in to continue to work with that tourism aspect from our architecture. So we got on education. Yeah.
Bang that drum, bang that drum.
Yes.
So in the spirit of more things change, the more they stay the same, I was intrigued to read an extract off the Leafroy Memorials, big green binders that's full of extracts from the early days of Bermuda. And in May of 1623, there was an act passed to restrict the outrageous charges of carpenters, joiners, and masons, and running up the cost of building in Bermuda. So in 1623, and we're talking about the same thing, but to be fair, we've seen a terrible run-up on the cost of construction in the last 5 or 6 years. That's in part triggered on by COVID, as we all know, but also to supply chains and all that. The one thing that hasn't changed that much in the last 10 years, working man's wages. We've seen a decline of the working man's wages in comparative to inflation. We've seen the costs go up, and of those base living costs, living income has not followed suit. That's another story for another day, but it's in part of what we're talking about here. So as part of this, you've heard from some terrific voices here and terrific ideas. Now it's your turn to participate. Does anyone in the audience have any questions which the panel could address for you? Okay, here's the question. With the derelict building being revitalized, will you ever see a return on your investment? Anyone?
I do believe that you can. It was spoken of about from a number of panelists prior to that. Some of that has a lot to do with the way in which you approach that. You know, it's about that conscious design, really. And so while there are things that are always going to be a fixed cost when you're talking about, you know, the actual construction or maybe even the labor going up or down, but your design decisions, the difference between I need to have a Callista faucet versus something I can just get at Gorham's, those are things that you can actually really tailor. A lot of the times we're seeing that price hike when you're getting into the owner-supplied items. And so I say yes. I also think that the way in which you approach design in general can also help with that. So again, going back to the sustainable piece and the way we originally built, things like cross-ventilation within the design itself, that changes the way you need to utilize air conditioning. So those may not be hard numbers, but there are ways in which you can implement design strategies that will make sure that your money is being allocated appropriately for your project. That's my take on it, Jonathan.
I'll just add on to that if I can.
Sure.
So as someone who has just recently inherited their family home, the cost difference between a powder-coated roof versus a latex paint roof gives you a long lead time. So what most Bermudians look at is an initial cost. That's what they all fixate at. It costs me 3 times more to do this option. However, the long-term solution is what you have to look at. So in response to your question, if you set up your house in a very specific way, you understand, I may not benefit from this now, but my future generation will by this decision. Investing in the new systems, they have a trial and error period. It happens. Same things happened with the heat pump in the last 5 years. The traditional heat pump and pressure tank have gone by the wayside. You now have DAB systems, you now have heat pump systems. They're now the industry standards. They cost more. However, it's a long-term thinking rather than a short-term thinking.
Okay. There was a question in the back?
Yes. 2 things. Number 1 is, could you clarify the difference between uninhabited, derelict, and listed, and the strategies towards those 3 different definitions or processes or standards? And can I ask the second question now, or you want to wait? Maybe we should do that one first.
Anyone want to?
Whoever.
Uninhabited, derelict, and the third?
Listed.
Listed.
I can speak to the listed if you like. So we have a listed buildings register. It has some, I think you said 790 odd properties. Some of those are historic monuments, and they're grades 1, 2, and 3. The vast majority of those listed buildings, I imagine, some of them are in excellent shape. They're lovingly cared for, but there are a handful of those that are in a declining state. And there's a few that in fact are uninhabited and falling into disrepair. So the listing is related to their architectural, historical, cultural value. It's nothing to do with the actual state of the building itself. It provides certain protections for those buildings because they have been deemed to be of cultural heritage value to the island.
If I could just jump in real quick, because I'm conscious of time here, I would assume that uninhabited is no one's living in the place. As we know, there's almost 4,000 uninhabited registered units now. Derelict would be something which is uninhabitable, roof systems, open to the weather, that sort of stuff, not in a habitable sense. So one last quick question, and then I think we're going to need to wrap it up. Oh, that gentleman right there. Share it about. Yeah? Sure.
Is this thing on? Okay. So my question is around those derelict or ruin listed properties. In some instances, like you said, they're owned by families. Maybe they can't afford to fix them up as they need to be fixed. And so my question is, how better can the National Trust and the government or any other entity collaborate if it is so precious that this property remain, as it holds all the culture and heritage of Bermuda, then shouldn't there be a better effort at trying to maintain it, because it could be listed, but if no one's doing anything to it and it falls into ruin, then you no longer have that piece of heritage to even speak of. So the question is around the collaborative effort that can be put in place to ensure that these valuable pieces of property and history don't fall into complete disrepair.
Okay, I think, Paul, you might be able to handle that one because it deals specifically with identifying properties.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think that the first stage that I mentioned was that we are doing the review of the listed buildings. So it is important to ensure that the buildings which are on the list are all worthy of being listed today. I do take your point, and I agree that it is a difficult concept to see, well, a reality really, to see a lot of buildings which not that long ago were in great condition, but they've been allowed to degenerate to a stage where you might as well demolish them now. They're not worth retaining. Planning doesn't really have any legislation to stop that from happening. It's not to say that we shouldn't. So I think, yeah, we do need to look at potentially looking at ways in which we can give greater protection to those buildings. And it does have to be recognized that some of the buildings are government owned as well. So I think government has to lead the way and be a good example for everybody else to follow.
Whoops. So we have time for one more question.
Right.
Sure.
The question I had with regard to reclaiming ruins, there is a rule of thumb that if the development exceeds 70% of the restorative state, then it should be demolished. So from a cost perspective, to build, we all know the cost is the same regardless of what we're building, whether it's residential. I'll speak to residential. But in the sense where the topic, reclaiming ruins, I'm just raising the question, if the ruin is in such a state that it's unrepairable from a practicality and feasible standpoint, would it make better sense and practical and more feasible to demolish that building and build from scratch?
I could help that one a little bit. A couple of years ago, the National Trust got involved with the Institute of Bermuda Architects, and we did a architectural survey of ancient buildings in St. George's, and that was 1993. It got started, and it's been done every year or several years following. And what that did, it gave a list, not a listed of building, but also a clear understanding of what the building was. I've used that same process to record buildings that were going to get destroyed for new development. And what, to your point, if in fact the cost of renovating that property far exceeds the value of the rebuild and stuff like that, I would suggest that an architectural drawing be done of the building, so we retain the memory of the building with its unique architectural details and icons, stuff like that. Have those drawings then listed with the National Archives or the National Trust or some other organization, such that the memory of the building still exists, although it's now made way for something else, something new.
And I can attest to that, actually. In my past lives, I actually worked at OBMI, and Colin had me survey those lovely cottages by Mount St. Agnes and Bull's Head. They're like 5-row cottage. One of them suffered a lot of fire. And in that process, we documented, recorded, we made a history. So while we talk about things having historical impact, it's usually one of two things. Either a meaningful event occurred there, or there's just a social attachment that this is an historical place. It's one of those two things. So if the building is in such a state that it cannot be repaired, document it, record it for the planning archives, make it a resource that can be pulled out into Akilah's point, educational classes. How did this building do something differently that another cottage didn't do, or likewise? Those minute details are important. They're history. They tell a story about how once people carved with their hands. Now it's all processed stuff these days. It's not a problem, but that's how you move forward. So starting from scratch, you identify what the building is, what do you want it to do, rather having this point of it has to do all these bigger 1, 2, 3, 4 plus things. My point to a client would be have it focus on one thing. What does it have to do very well? Make it the one sole purpose. Can the building accommodate that purpose? No. Does it have historical value? Yes or no. You kind of do this whole graph chart thing. And then if the building can't meet those, then I think from a society point of view, document it, demolish it to the point and then build something new that can last another 50 years.
Okay, so last but not least, education's an important part of this whole process. Don't overlook what we already have. The National Trust and the Department of Planning got involved with a architectural building guide some 10 years ago or so, which is a very good, valuable resource for all sorts of things, old paint, old plaster, what have you. And also the National Trust with their wonderful parish series of all the various houses. And then there's any numbers of tips and ideas. So we've got a lot at our fingertips. We just have to get using them. That's all. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for your time and your attention, and look forward to the next presentation.